Hi guys, this is the Unit 5 Lesson 5 video. In this video I'm going to show you the last algebraic method for solving a quadratic equation, which is called the quadratic formula. And as it sounds, it is a formula. It is a long formula that looks very scary, but once you get used to it, you'll be fine. The good news is this is not a formula that you have to memorize. You do not have to memorize this formula. So here it is. This is called the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then that whole thing is divided by 2a. And if you remember the standard form of a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c, then you can see that the number that's in front of the x squared gets plugged into a couple spots, the number that's in front of x gets plugged into a couple of spots, and the number that's the constant gets plugged in as well. So as long as you have this formula to reference, then you will be able to plug those numbers in and solve the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic you want. So if you remember in class, we've talked about when to use the square root method, when to use the factoring method, and when to use complete the square. So when should you use the quadratic formula? You can use a quadratic formula for any quadratic equation. So of course, if you're told to use the quadratic formula, or if you're told to use a specific method, you'll use it. But if you're not told, you can always use the quadratic formula. Just keep in mind that sometimes other methods are easier. Let me show you how we use the quadratic formula. First of all, notice the standard form of a quadratic equal to 0. So just like when we factor, we have to get it equal to 0. So take a look at this example. X squared plus 12x equals negative 20. So we're going to do first, we're going to put it in standard form and get it equal to 0. So what does that mean we have to do? Well, we have to add 20 to both sides so that this side will be equal to 0. When you do that, please remember that you're looking over here for like terms. X squared, x, and a constant are not like terms. So we're going to have the trinomial x squared plus 12x plus 20 equals 0. Now that we have it in standard form, which is the first thing we have to do, we are going to list the values for a, b, and c. So you're going to write a equals, b equals, and c equals. So this is always going to be the second thing that you do. A is the number in front of x squared, which in this case is an invisible 1. B is the number in front of x, which in this case is 12. And c is the constant, which in this case is 20. So you're going to list those, and then you're going to plug those numbers into the quadratic formula, which you have to have written on your paper before you use it. Since I have it over here, I'm not going to write it down over here, but you should write it down before you do this next part. So pause the video and write down the quadratic formula in here, and then you can start it back up. So we're going to have x equals, now we're going to make a giant fraction. We're going to put negative, and then we're going to put b. So we're going to put a negative, and then we're going to put b. In this case, b is 12. So we just put negative 12. Plus or minus, remember that plus or minus from the square root method and from completing the square? That's in the quadratic formula. And make a nice square root, because plus or minus always comes in front of the square root. You're going to put b squared, so we're going to put 12, because b was 12 squared, minus 4 times a times c. So we're going to plug in a and c in parentheses. A is 1, so we plug it in parentheses, and c is 20, so we plug that in parentheses. And make sure your fraction bar is nice and long here, okay? On the bottom of the fraction, we're going to put 2 times, and then we're going to fill in a, which is 1. Okay, so once you get all those numbers plugged in, you're going to kind of simplify things up nicely. So step 3 here is to plug the numbers in. Step 4 is going to be just to simplify some things. So we're going to have x equals, make your fraction bar here. We're going to keep negative 12 because that is simplified, plus or minus the square root, and we're going to figure out what this is equal to. This little guy under the radical is called the discriminant. That's a big word. But the discriminant actually tells us the type of roots that we have based on what kind of number this is. This you can type in your calculator if you want to. So you're going to do 12 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. And I'll just show you really quickly how you can do that. Hopefully you already know. 12 squared, and then you would put minus 4 times 1 times 20, and you would get 64. So you're going to put inside the radical right here, 64. And on the bottom, you're going to multiply. 2 times 1 is 2. Okay? Step 5 is to simplify this radical. What is the square root of 64? Oh, the square root of 64 is 8, or plus or minus 8. Remember that, but the plus or minus is already over here. So we're going to go ahead and fill that in. So now we have x equals negative 12 plus or minus 8 over 2. Now, what do we do when we complete the square and the radical disappears? We split it into two separate equations. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to make two separate equations. X equals negative 12 plus 8 over 2. And the other one is going to be x equals negative 12 minus 8 over 2. Remember, the only thing that you do here is you change this sign in each equation. And then you solve this. What is negative 12 plus 8? Negative 12 plus 8 is negative 4, and negative 4 over 2 is negative 2. Negative 12 minus 8 is negative 20, and negative 20 over 2 is negative 10. So the answers are negative 2 and negative 10. Those are the two roots or solutions or zeros of this equation. All right, now that was nice. It turned out to be whole numbers, so that was fun. And so, by the way, if you didn't notice way back at the top, that was factorable. So if you were not told to use a quadratic formula, it would have been much quicker to factor. Let's look at another example here. All right, so we have x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. We have some good news here. It's already in standard form. So we have step 1 done. Step 2 is to list the values of a, b, and c. A is the number in front of x squared, so it's 1. B is the number in front of x, so it's negative 6. C is the constant, so it is 3. Now just for 1 second, check real quick. Would AM work here? Are there two numbers that add to negative 6 and multiply to positive 3? The answer to that is no. Now, this is an even number, so complete the square would work just fine. But since we're on the quadratic formula, that's what we're going to use. But now you know that that would be another option. Okay, so the quadratic formula, x equals, make a nice fraction bar here. Now, when b is a negative number, you have to plug it in parentheses. So you're going to put negative, and then you're going to plug in negative 6 in parentheses, plus or minus the square root of negative 6, because that's b in parentheses, squared, minus 4 times a is 1 times c is 3. On the bottom, we have 2 times a, which is 1. Next step is to simplify each part of the fraction. Negative negative 6 is 6, plus or minus the square root. Negative 6 squared is 36, 4 times 1 times 3 is 12, and 36 minus 12 is 24. Again, you can plug that into your calculator if you want, and simplify the bottom. 2 times 1 is 2. Our next step is to simplify the radical. Now, I like to bring that outside of the fraction and just do it over here so I'm not confused by the fraction. So the square root of 24, how do we simplify that? Largest perfect square that goes into 24 is 4. So it's radical 4, radical 6, and the square root of 4 is 2. So it's 2 radical 6. Remember, you should already know how to do this from previously in the unit. So we're going to just plug that in over here. X equals 6 plus or minus 2 radical 6 over 2. Now, we have a radical in the equation, so we do not have to split it up, although you can split it up if you want to. You do not have to. So, this is done as long as the whole numbers do not have something in common. Well, our whole numbers are 6, 2, and 2, and all of those are divisible by 2. So we're going to reduce those numbers all by 2. And so I kind of think of this as like a little heart, okay, for Valentine's Day, right? Put a heart around it. All three of those numbers need to be divided by 2. So I have x equals 6 divided by 2 is 3, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 is 1, so it's 1 radical 6, or just radical 6. Notice that the radical 6 is not inside the heart, so it cannot be divided by 2. That's going to stay as it is. And then we're going to put this over, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So then, because this is over 1, this can just be fixed up really quickly to x equals 3 plus or minus radical 6, and that is your answer. Now remember, that gives us two separate roots of 3 plus radical 6 and 3 minus radical 6. Those are the two separate roots. Now I know this has already been more than 10 minutes, but I want to do one more example. I'm going to do it quickly, and then you can pause it if you need to copy it down. First thing we want to do here is get this in standard form. So this is the tricky part here. We need to minus the 101 and add the 18x to both sides, and then put it in standard form. Okay, so take these three terms and write them in standard form. X squared plus 18x minus 101 equals 0. Now that we're in standard form, A is 1, B is 18, and C is negative 101. Make my big long fraction bar here. I'm going to plug in negative 18. Remember, you only have to put B in parentheses if it's negative. It wasn't negative. This negative is from the formula. Plus or minus the square root of 18 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 101 all over 2 times 1. Okay, so then we can type this part into the calculator. So I have 18 squared, this one I don't know off the top of my head, 18 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 101 is 728. So now I have x equals, simplify each part, negative 18 is good, plus or minus the square root of 728 all over 2 times 1 is 2. Simplify the radical. Radical 728, and we need to find the two things where 1 is a perfect square that goes into 728. And so, believe it or not, I'll just tell you here, it's actually 4. That's the largest perfect square that goes into 728, and it goes in 182 times. So now we're going to reduce that to 2 radical 182. All right, so we're going to fill that in over here. Hold on a second, I'm going to extend my page. We're going to fill that in over here as x equals negative 18 plus or minus 2 radical 182 all over 2. Now let's make our heart for Valentine's Day, and our heart has the numbers negative 18, 2, and 2. 2 goes into all of them. So x equals 2 goes in negative 9 plus or minus, that goes in once, so radical 182, and the bottom again would be 1, so I'm just not going to write that since I know that that would turn out to be 1. So all three of these numbers get divided by 2, and so here is the answer. These are the roots to this equation, and remember that also would turn into negative 9 plus radical 182 and negative 9 minus radical 182. Those would be the two separate roots. So that is all for now. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in class.